Our mother died this morning. We have nowhere to go. These words made Mark Truman stop in his tracks. His heart seemed to slow in that moment, and the air around him shifted. On the steps of the building that bore his name, there stood two girls. The older one, her familiar face silent, seemed to tell a story of knowing too much too soon. The younger one, just 5 years old, shivered in the cold, clutching a stuffed rabbit as though it were the only thing tethering her to this world. The older girl, Alice, spoke again, her words hanging in the air like a heavy breath before the storm. Our mother died this morning. We have nowhere to go. Before we continue following the dramatic developments ahead, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to give me motivation to keep bringing you more captivating stories. And where are you listening to this story from? Leave a comment and let me know. Now, let's return to the story. Mark didn't move. At first, he didn't respond. His brain, trained in the art of decision-making, in the ability to break life into spreadsheets and meetings, couldn't process the weight of those words. A child standing in front of him spoke with a calmness that should not have been possible. A child told him her mother had died, and there was no one left for her and her sister. He stood frozen, locked in the cold, his thoughts a blur. The wind, sharp and bitter, cut through his coat. The doorman, a man who had watched Mark for years with a knowing gaze, looked nervously through the glass door, but no one moved to help. No one stepped forward, Mr. Truman? The older girl's voice cut through again, this time softer, but still firm. Our mother said, if anything happens, find him, he will help. Dade Mark's chest tightened. Help? What could he do? The girls were strange. They meant nothing in his world, a world where names and numbers carried more weight than life itself. But those words hung between him and them. He looked over at the valet, who stood silently in the background, unsure whether to intervene. The older girl, Alice, stared at him with an intensity that made him tremble. She wasn't pleading, wasn't asking for pity. She simply stated a truth. Her mother had told her to find him. That was the only reason she stood there, in front of a man who could buy and sell entire industries, yet seemed to have no answer for the smallest tragedies of life. How did you get here? Mark's voice stiffened, almost involuntarily. We walked, Alice answered. In this weather. There was no snow when we left. Mark turned, mentally calculating their route. No one had told him the girls were waiting out there. How long had they been sitting on a bench, buried in snowmelt? He looked again at the valet, his eyes narrowing in anger and confusion. He turned back to the girls, to Alice, who spoke again without hesitation. Mom said you were a good man once. Maybe you'll remember how. Mark's stomach clenched at the words, at their unexpected weight. A good man? Did that even mean anything anymore? Power, wealth, none of it had made him feel good in years. He had built his empire on the cold precision of strategy. But standing there, in front of these two girls, everything he had fought for, everything he thought he knew, seemed to slip away. Remember how? The younger girl, Julia, stood quietly, holding her stuffed rabbit, her eyes wide and innocent, but her lips slightly blue from the cold. There was no fear in her gaze, only confusion, as though she had no idea what was going on around her. But Alice, the older girl, was different. Her eyes were older than her years, wise in a way that spoke of survival, of a life lived to protect the most important person to her. Alice spoke again, her voice steady, but her words were a burden that Mark had not anticipated. We have nowhere else to go, he sighed, trying to steady himself in a world that had suddenly become unfamiliar. He had no experience with this. He had been raised with money, with privilege, with the belief that a man could do anything if he had enough power. But this moment, these two girls, challenged everything he had ever believed. He couldn't just turn away. He couldn't let them stand there, alone. Without thinking, he nodded toward the building's door. "Come inside," he said. "You need warmth." Alice hesitated for just a second, then nodded. She turned, leading Julia into the building, their footsteps crunching in the snow as they passed Mark. The doorman stepped aside without saying a word, and Mark felt a strange tension in his chest, a sense of guilt he couldn't shake. Inside, the warmth hit him like a wave. The marble lobby, glossy and pristine, almost felt too much. The staff, accustomed to the world of billionaires, watched the girls carefully, unsure of what to do. Mark turned back to the valet. "Cancel my car," he said. "Call my office. I won't be going to Houston." The valet blinked, clearly unsure of what was happening. "Sir," he said hesitantly. "Just do it," Mark snapped. And as he led the girls to the elevator, he realized something. He wasn't sure if it was guilt, compassion, or something entirely different, but he had made his decision. And there was no turning back. The elevator hummed as it ascended, its metallic walls reflecting the quiet unease in Mark's face. The girls stood behind him, Alice holding Julia's hand tightly. Julia leaned into her sister's coat, the weight of the day finally catching up with her. She was small, barely able to stand without swaying, but there was something about her stillness that pulled Mark's thoughts away from the cold gleam of the building, away from the harsh world of his business meetings and schedules. Alice glanced at the elevator buttons, then at the floor numbers as they flickered by. She said nothing, but the air between them was thick with something unspoken, something larger than either of them could fully understand. Mark didn't want to ask, didn't want to dig deeper. He wasn't ready to know what had brought them here. "No, 17th floor," he muttered, his voice quiet, as though he were trying to anchor himself back into the routine of his life. His mind, however, kept drifting to Alice's words, the strange weight of them. "You were a good man once. Maybe you'd remember how, but that felt like a lifetime ago." And the man who had built an empire on cold calculation didn't feel so good anymore, not here. Not with these girls in front of him. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Mark stepped out into the quiet corridor, the plush carpet swallowing their footsteps. He unlocked room Ichenchibaitlingar, a place he often used for private meetings, a sanctuary of marble and leather, of power and luxury. The door swung open, and the starkness of the space seemed to reflect the emptiness he felt. Alice stood still, surveying the room with a calm that bordered on indifference. Julia, on the other hand, was wide-eyed, taking in everything around her. An expensive couch, a crackling fire, a room that seemed too grand for her small body. It didn't feel like a place for comfort, not yet. "There's a bathroom there," Mark said, his voice a little rougher than he intended. "Towels, soap, warm water." He opened the fridge and pulled out 2 bottles of orange juice, handing them to the girls. The action felt oddly familiar, like something he should have done long ago. Go for a child who wasn't his, for a family that hadn't yet been built. Julia took her juice with both hands, her fingers trembling as she raised it to her lips. Alice hesitated, her eyes flicking from the bottle to Mark. She didn't seem to trust it. But eventually she accepted her movements, deliberate and cautious. Mark sat across from them, his glass of scotch untouched, staring into the fire. The warmth felt like an illusion, a temporary shield from the storm outside, inside his chest and in the world beyond the walls of this penthouse. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire, the soft thud of the girls' boots on the polished floor as they shifted, restless. He cleared his throat, trying to focus. "Tell me what happened." Alice looked at him, the words slow in coming, crow, as though she was choosing each one carefully. She shifted in her seat, glancing at Julia before speaking again. Mom got sick last week, coughing real bad. She said it was just a cold, but then she couldn't stand up straight. She paused, her eyes dropping to the floor. We don't got heat in the trailer. Power cuts out a lot. Mark listened, nodding. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. There was no handbook for this. No line of dialogue that could undo the simple fact that a mother was gone and two girls were left behind. Oh, in the cold, in the dark. Alice continued, her voice more composed now, though it cracked with a quiet sorrow. Mom said if she didn't wake up one morning, we should find you. She said you were a good man once, and maybe you'd remember how. The words hit Mark harder than he expected. A good man. What did that even mean anymore? He had built his life on the idea of success, on power, wealth, control. But standing here in this room with these girls, all of that felt meaningless. What was success if it couldn't even offer safety, if it couldn't protect a child from the cold? He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to the raw honesty in Alice's voice, the quiet burden she carried. His mind whirled, but it landed on only one thing certain: he wasn't going to walk away. He wasn't going to leave them like this, not again. Did you tell anyone else? Mark asked, his voice quieter now. Alice shook her head, her eyes never leaving his. We didn't know who to call. We just waited outside till someone said you were inside. Mark stood, pacing the length of the room. The fire crackled behind him, but it didn't offer warmth. Outside, the city hummed with its usual rhythm. But in here, in this room, everything felt unmoored. He had no answers, no plans, no clue how to fix this. He rubbed a hand over his face, his jaw tightening as he fought against the feeling that had risen in his chest. What am I doing? He stopped pacing and turned back to them, his decision made before he had time to fully understand it. You can't stay here, he said slowly, his voice firm. I'm not your family. I can't just keep you here. Alice didn't flinch. She met his gaze, unwavering. We know, she said simply. We didn't come to stay. We came so someone would see us. The word stunned him. Someone would see us. What had they been through that made this moment so desperate? A child walking through a storm with nothing but the hope that someone would notice. Mark swallowed the lump in his throat. He stepped toward them, a man divided between his own careful world of wealth and separation and the stark reality Come on, he said, his voice softer now. You both need heat. Alice hesitated, but then she nodded. She helped Julia to her feet, guiding her past Mark and into the warmth of the penthouse. Mark followed them, the weight of the moment pressing down on him with every step. They weren't just walking into his building. They were walking into a life that Mark had built but had never truly lived. And something in him began to shift, something he hadn't expected. As they walked through the hall, the silence felt almost sacred, and Mark realized that this moment, this unexpected turn, had already changed him. They weren't just asking for help. They were offering him something he hadn't known he needed, an awakening to the life he had ignored for far too long. The hallway seemed impossibly long, stretching out ahead of them, as Mark led Alice and Julia to the suite. His steps echoed against the polished floor. Ooh. And the soft hum of the building's ventilation was the only sound that filled the silence. The girls, for their part, were quiet, their footsteps lighter than his, their presence a soft but constant reminder of everything that was wrong and everything that was suddenly right. The door to the suite opened with a soft click, and Mark stepped aside to let them in. He didn't say anything as they crossed the threshold. Oh, their boots leaving wet marks on the marble floor. The warmth inside hit them immediately. Co and Julia blinked up in surprise as she stepped into the space. The grandeur of it seemed to overwhelm her for a moment. This was no place for children like them. But Alice, ever the protector, stepped forward, pulling Julia with her toward the couch. "Sit," Mark said quietly. He pointed to the plush leather couch across from him, where he had seated himself with a drink in hand, but the glass remained untouched. Julia, tired and confused, nestled herself into the cushions, her stuffed rabbit still clutched tightly in her arms. Alice, however, stood still for a moment, her gaze flicking across the room before settling back on Mark. She was measuring him just as she had measured everything around her, always calculating the distance between herself and the people she met, never fully letting them in. The fire crackled softly in the corner. But it felt out of place in this room, as if it were pretending to offer warmth. The marble walls, the expensive furniture, none of it meant anything to Alice. It was as though she had stepped into a dream. A space so far removed from her reality that she couldn't quite believe it was real. "Tell me what happened," Mark repeated, trying to bring some order to the chaos that had suddenly erupted around him. His voice was less firm now, an attempt to pull together the fragments of his thoughts. Alice exhaled, and for a moment her eyes softened, just slightly. She glanced at Julia, who had curled up into a ball, her eyes already half closed. Then she turned back to Mark, her expression hardening again. "Mama got sick last week. Coughing real bad," Alice said. Her voice soft but steady. She had told this story already, but the telling didn't make it any easier. She said it was just a cold, but then she couldn't stand up anymore. "We don't got heat in the trailer. The power goes out all the time." Mark nodded, listening intently. But inside something shifted. A cold, no heat, no power. These were things that shouldn't exist in the world he inhabited. Things that shouldn't be part of a child's life. But here they were, the stark reality of it, standing before him in the form of two girls, whose entire world had been so unsteady, so fragile, that they had to walk through a snowstorm just to find a place where someone might care. And if she didn't wake up one morning, she said, "We should find you." Alice continued, her voice barely a whisper now. "She said you were a good man once." Mark closed his eyes briefly, the weight of her words pressing on him. A good man once. It felt like a lifetime ago. He had buried that part of himself so deep under the armor of success, of wealth, of power, that he had nearly forgotten it existed. But Alice's words stirred something in him, something long dormant. He opened his eyes and looked at her, at both of them. And for the first time in a long time he felt something unfamiliar stir inside him. Guilt? Regret? Or maybe it was just the raw truth that he had become so disconnected from the world outside of his empire that he couldn't even recognize the hunger for warmth and safety when it stood before him. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, as if trying to justify his inability to fully comprehend the situation. "I'm not your family. I can't just take you in." Alice didn't flinch. She didn't move. She just looked at him, eyes steady, like someone who had long ago learned that the world didn't give what you asked for, that things didn't come with explanations or comfort. "We know," she said. "We didn't come to stay. We just need someone to see us." Mark's heart tightened, and for a moment the room felt smaller, the air thicker. He didn't know how to fix this. He didn't know what he could do. His mind raced with the possibilities, social services, foster care, legal loopholes. all of them foreign and far removed from the little girl sitting in front of him. The weight of responsibility, of compassion, pressed on him like a heavy hand. "I'm not your savior," he muttered under his breath, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. He had already stepped in, already allowed this moment to unfold. He could turn away, sure, but he would carry this moment with him. He would carry Alice's words and the weight of them, the weight of two children who had come to him not for pity, not for charity, but for the simple hope that someone would see them. Mark took a deep breath, steadied himself, and made a decision. He turned toward the building's elevator. "Come inside," he said, motioning for them to follow him. "You both need heat." Alice hesitated for a moment longer, but then, with a silent nod, she helped Julia to her feet. Together they followed him inside. Mark watched them carefully, the tension in his chest still heavy, go but slowly, steadily. Something began to shift within him. Alice had asked him to remember something he had buried, something that felt long forgotten. And though he didn't know it yet, that simple request was the first crack in the armor he had so carefully built around his heart. The elevator doors closed behind them, and as it ascended, Mark realized that something had already started to change. He didn't know where this would lead. He didn't know how to navigate it, how to guide them, or what would come next. But he knew that he couldn't just turn away. He couldn't leave them, not when they were standing there, looking at him with nothing but hope. The elevator climbed steadily, its quiet hum a background to the shifting tension in Mark's mind. As they ascended, the metallic walls reflected their faces, casting fleeting images of uncertainty and quiet fear. Alice, standing closest to the doors, held herself taller than her years. She wasn't crying, not like a child should, not like the world had forced her to be. No, she was silent, calculating as though her survival depended on it, and in a way, it did. Julia, her small hand clutching the fabric of Alice's coat, leaned against her sister. The weight of exhaustion hung over her like a cloud, though she didn't dare show it. Her eyes fluttered closed briefly, but she remained upright, anchored in her sister's care. And yet somehow Mark knew she had already learned the hardest lesson of all. The world was a place where you had to fight for everything. Rest. As the elevator stopped and the doors slid open with a soft chime, Mark stepped forward. The suite before them felt foreign, unwelcoming almost. The plush carpets, the polished furniture, the fire crackling quietly in the corner. It was a world they were strangers to, a world he had built for power, not for warmth. The girls hesitated as they crossed the threshold, their boots leaving marks on the marble floors, as if the very act of entering this space demanded something they were unwilling to give. Mark watched them silently, noting the way Alice surveyed the room, her eyes scanning it, measuring it against some invisible standard. She looked at the leather couches, the grand fireplace, the expansive windows with their view of the city beyond. But she didn't look in awe. No, she was calculating, trying to make sense of something that didn't belong in a life like hers. Julia, on the other hand, was more like a breath of fresh air. She was overwhelmed by the size, the opulence of it all. But she couldn't help herself. Her eyes darted from one corner of the room to the next, finding wonder in places that should have felt cold and empty. She stepped forward cautiously, almost reverently, her stuffed rabbit tucked tightly in her arms. "This is—" Julia began, her voice small, her eyes wide. She didn't have the words for the world she had just stepped into. "Sit," Mark said softly, motioning to the long leather couch across from him. The command, so casual, felt almost out of place. The world he lived in, the world that had always been his, didn't require much more than simple gestures, simple words. But something in him, the part of him that was still tethered to his humanity, to his past, wanted to make them comfortable, make them feel safe, even if it was only for tonight. Alice, after a long moment, guided Julia to the couch. The fire crackled behind them, its warmth cutting through the chill of the room. Mark had never understood the power of such simple things before. But in that moment, as he watched Alice help her sister settle in, something in his chest tightened. He sat across from them, a glass of scotch in his hand. But the glass was untouched, its amber hue reflecting the firelight. And the alcohol seemed to burn less than the questions swirling in his mind. What now? He opened his mouth, unsure of how to begin. It was clear that this was not a conversation with easy answers, but with truths that had yet to be uncovered. "Tell me what happened," he asked, though it felt like a question with no real answer. Alice was quiet at first, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the fire, as though she was summoning the strength to speak. Then slowly she exhaled. "Mom got sick last week, coughing real bad. She said it was just a cold at first, but then she couldn't stand up anymore. We don't got heat in the trailer. Power cuts out all the time." Mark nodded, listening intently. Oh, but inside, something shifted. A cold, no heat, no power. These were things that shouldn't exist in the world he inhabited, things that shouldn't be part of a child's life. But here they were, in front of him, two girls who had lived through more in their short lives than most people would ever. Alice didn't stop there. She said if she didn't wake up, we should find you. She said you were a good man once. Mark winced at the words, a dull ache blossoming in his chest. A good man once. He could hear the weight of them, the simple trust in her voice, the weight of the responsibility that had been placed on him. He had no answers for her, no easy solution. The wealth he had amassed, the empire he had built, meant nothing in the face of this raw, unrelenting truth. He had been given a second chance, at redemption, at doing something that mattered, something that could change the course of their lives. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Alice," she replied without hesitation. "My sister's Julia." Mark turned his gaze to Julia, who was now staring at him with eyes too wise for her age. Her lips were slightly blue from the cold, her cheeks flushed from the chill, but she said nothing. Her silence was heavier than anything Alice could have said. Julia was too young to understand fully, but there was an understanding in her eyes, a trust she had placed in the world that had betrayed her. "And where's your mother now?" Mark asked, his voice softer now, as if he were trying to break the dam of grief that had settled between them. "At home," Alice replied, "on the couch, still." The word hung in the air like an echo, reverberating in the stillness of the room. Still. A mother, gone, waiting for a body that could no longer move, coat lying in a place that once had been home, now abandoned by the warmth it should have provided. Mark's mind raced. How could this happen? How could someone, anyone, live like this? And then, just as quickly, he pushed the thought aside. This wasn't about his shock, his discomfort. It was about what these girls needed, what they had always needed. He stood up abruptly, walking to the window. He could feel the cold pressing against the glass, the city stretching out beneath him, uncaring, indifferent. But here, in this moment, he knew something had changed. He was no longer just Mark Truman, the billionaire businessman. He was now something else entirely, something he hadn't been in a long time. A man who had to reckon with his past, with his choices, and with the lives that had been left in his wake. Turning back toward them, he spoke, his voice steady but uncertain. "Why me?" Alice didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She simply spoke, her words heavy with the burden of something no child should ever have to carry. Mom said you used to know right from wrong before you got rich. If this moment touched something deep within you, you're not alone." Mark's breath caught in his throat. Alice's words had come to him like a jolt of cold water, a reminder that what he had built, what he had focused on for so long, was only this moment. The one that stood before him was something that had to matter more than all of it. His heart raced as he moved toward the girls, his decisions already forming. The walls he had built were falling, crumbling slowly, and in their place there was only one thing left to do. "Come inside," he said quietly. "You both need heat." Alice nodded, and Julia, without a word, followed her sister's lead. Mark watched them, a strange ache settling deep in his chest, and realized that this was the moment that would define him. There was no going back. Mark stood in the doorway, watching as Alice and Julia stepped deeper into the suite, their small, shivering forms swallowed by the warmth of the room. The contrast was staggering. The coldness of their lives now replaced by this almost obscene luxury. He should have been offering them comfort, he realized. Oh, but the room felt alien, like a museum of wealth rather than a home. Alice, as always, was the first to settle. She guided Julia over to the couch, the small one curling into the cushions, still clutching her stuffed rabbit, her breath coming in uneven little gasps. Julia's small eyes fluttered shut as soon as her head hit the armrest, and Mark couldn't help but marvel at how exhausted she was. She had the look of someone who had never truly rested, even in sleep. Alice stood, still holding herself rigid, almost as if she were afraid to let go of the weight she had carried for so long. Her eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in the space, but her expression never changed. She was silent as she always had been, her face unreadable. Mark couldn't figure her out, couldn't understand the strength it took to hold the world at arm's length the way she did. He moved to the bar, pouring himself a drink, though his hand trembled slightly as he lifted the glass to his lips. The familiar burn of alcohol didn't soothe him like it once did. Instead, it only made him more aware of how far away he had drifted from everything that once mattered, how far away he was from the life he had imagined for himself. "Tell me what happened," he said again, though he wasn't sure why. He already knew the answer. But this wasn't about facts. It was about finding a way to understand, to break through the walls Alice had built around herself. She hesitated, but then spoke, her voice quieter than before, as if she were allowing herself to admit something she didn't want to say. "Mom got worse last week. We ran out of medicine. I kept asking her if she wanted to go to the hospital. She said no. She said it was too late." The words hung in the air between them. Too late. Mark felt a sharp pang, a twist of something deep inside him. Too late. Alice glanced toward the window, as though searching for something outside, something to anchor herself to. We didn't have the money to get the heat fixed. Mom said she couldn't get us any help. She said we should just wait until someone saw us." Mark had to stop himself from reacting. He couldn't let his emotions cloud the situation. But the sheer weight of Alice's words, of the lives they had lived so far removed from the one he had carved out for himself, pressed down on him like a rock. Wait until someone saw us. How many children in the world had lived and died in that same helpless space, waiting for someone to notice them? How many had been invisible, even as they cried out for help? He set the glass down hard, the clink of the crystal sharp in the silence. What happens now? Alice's eyes flicked to him, sharp and steady. She didn't flinch, didn't show any of the weakness he had expected. Instead, she just said, "I don't know." "Mama said you'd help us, said you'd remember how." Mark swallowed. "I don't know how to help you." "I'm not your family." Alice's gaze softened, but only slightly. She stood there, almost as if waiting for something more from him, something beyond the sterile environment of the suite, something beyond the cold wealth he had built around himself. Her voice was quiet when she spoke again, as if it had taken everything in her to say the words. "We don't want your money," she said firmly. "We don't want pity. We just want to be safe." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. "We just want to be safe." Mark didn't know what to say. He couldn't offer them a perfect solution, couldn't promise them safety or security or any of the things they needed most. All he could do was listen and be there, just be there. But even that, he realized, would be more than they had ever known. Or he stepped forward, his movements hesitant. He looked at Alice, then at Julia, who had finally fallen into a deep, dreamless sleep on the couch. Her face was peaceful now, but Mark knew that wouldn't last. Nothing in her life had ever been peaceful, and that quiet face wouldn't remain so for long. He opened his mouth, about to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he say? What could anyone say when the world had failed these girls so completely, so utterly? Finally he spoke, his voice rough. "I don't know how to fix this, but I'll try. I'll do what I can." Alice didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. She just watched him, measuring him in a way that seemed almost older than her years. There was no warmth in her expression, no relief. But there was trust, quiet trust, that she had placed in him, even though she didn't yet know what he was capable of, or whether he could actually follow through. "Why me?" Mark asked again, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "Why did you come to me?" Alice's expression softened just a fraction, though her gaze remained unyielding. "You used to know right from wrong before you got rich," she said. "I thought maybe you'd remember how." Right from wrong, the words hit him like a slap. He had forgotten. He had become so wrapped up in the pursuit of success, in the building of his empire, that he had forgotten the basics, the simple human things that made life worth living, the things that had once mattered. But in that moment, Mark realized something. There was no going back, no undoing the years of ambition and isolation. But there was something in his reach, something worth fighting for, even if it meant breaking apart the life he had built. He wasn't sure how to start, but he knew that it had to begin here, with Alice and Julia. "I'll help," he said again, more firmly this time, "for as long as you need." Alice didn't smile, but she nodded just once, and that was enough for Mark. He wasn't sure what would happen next. He didn't have all the answers. But in this room with these girls for the first time in years, Mark Truman felt like he was standing on the edge of something that mattered. The quiet that followed seemed to stretch out, filled with unsaid things. The fire crackled softly in the background, a faint noise against the silence that hung in the room. Mark sat down across from Alice and Julia, the warmth of the fire contrasting with the cold weight of his thoughts. He didn't know what to do or where to begin. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with money or meetings, or the type of strategic thinking that had carried him so far in his life. This was different. This was real. The kind of real that stripped away the veneer of his world and made everything he had built seem so distant, so inconsequential. Alice sat with her legs crossed, her eyes not quite meeting his, but not looking away either. She was still in her coat, still carrying the weight of a life that had given her more pain than anyone her age should have to bear. Julia, nestled on the couch, had drifted into a deeper sleep, her breathing slow and even, her stuffed rabbit now resting by her side. forgotten in the safety of a moment she hadn't been given in years. Mark glanced at the girl, his chest tightening. A child shouldn't have to go through this, he thought. A child shouldn't have to carry that kind of weight. And yet, here they were, in this room, in this place, now so far removed from the lives they had known, but still shackled by their pasts. He thought about his son, about the pain that had been his constant companion, and realized that the ache he felt was not so different from theirs. A movement across the room caught his attention. Alice had stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked over to the window and stood there, her gaze fixed outside, but her face turned slightly toward him, as though she were aware of his scrutiny but was choosing to ignore it. The city sprawled beneath them, vast and indifferent. But here, in this space, with these girls, Mark could feel something in him stir, a desire to protect, to do more than just provide comfort. He wanted to fix this, to give them the safety they had been denied. "Do you want some food?" Mark asked, though it felt like the question itself was inadequate. Food? What did food matter right now? What did any of this luxury matter when these girls had come to him for help, for something real? He was a man of resources, of wealth, of contracts and numbers. But this felt different. Alice looked at him then, her eyes steady as though she were weighing him again, just as she had before. But this time there was something softer in her gaze, something that told Mark she might believe him, just for a moment. "What is there?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. The edge of suspicion gone. The edge of suspicion gone. Mark exhaled, standing up and walking toward the kitchen. "There's grilled cheese, tomato soup." "Something simple," he said, his mind racing. "You're welcome to have whatever you like." He opened the refrigerator, pulling out the ingredients, trying to focus on something so simple, so basic, that it felt like it might ground him. As he worked, he thought about Alice's words. "You used to know right from wrong before you got rich." And something about that made his chest tighten, made his hands falter for just a moment as he spread butter on the bread. Right from wrong, it wasn't something he'd given much thought to in recent years. His life had been about more complicated things: profit margins, quarterly reports, investments, mergers. But in the quiet of this moment, with the fire crackling softly behind him, the weight of Alice's words came crashing down. What did it mean to be a good man when everything you had built was based on power and wealth? What had happened to the man who had once cared, who had once believed in something more than his own success? Mark finished making the sandwiches and set them down on the counter, looking over at the girls. Alice had moved closer, her eyes now focused on the food in front of her. But she still hadn't said anything. Julia stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering open as the smell of food filled the room. Mark felt a strange tug in his chest. Sure, he didn't know what he had expected when he brought them into his world. Maybe he thought they would be grateful. Or maybe he was just trying to fill the emptiness he felt. Resembled normalcy. But there was nothing normal about this. Nothing that could be fixed with food or clothes or anything else that came easily to him. As Julia sat up, rubbing her eyes and looking at the food, Mark caught Alice's gaze. There was something in her eyes now, a glimmer of something, perhaps acceptance, perhaps just the quiet resignation of someone who had learned too much too early. She didn't speak as she reached for the sandwich. No, but her hand brushed his as she took it. It was a brief touch, one that lasted for only a moment, but it sent a shock through him. In that moment, Mark realized that this was what mattered. This was what he had been missing all these years, buried beneath the layers of his wealth, his work, his walls. He had built a life that was supposed to make him happy. But it was in this room with these two girls that he found something he hadn't realized he was searching for. A reason to care, a reason to fight for something that was real, something worth protecting. Julia took a bite of the sandwich, her face lighting up in delight, and Mark watched her, his heart swelling with an unfamiliar warmth. It was a small thing, but it felt like a victory in a world that had seemed so far removed from the simple joys of a child's laughter, a child's trust. Alice's eyes flicked toward him again, and for the first time there was no calculation in her gaze. There was no distance, just the quiet understanding of someone who had seen too much and who, for the first time, was being given a chance to let go. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. But there was something in it now, something soft, something Mark hadn't heard before. He nodded, though he didn't know how to respond. What could he say? "I'm sorry," it seemed inadequate. The words weren't enough to make up for what they had been through, for the life they had been forced to live. But they were enough for now. For now, he was here. And that was something. The silence that followed seemed to stretch out, filled with unsaid things. The fire crackled softly in the background, a faint noise against the silence that hung in the room. Mark sat down across from Alice and Julia, the warmth of the fire contrasting with the cold weight of his thoughts. He didn't know what to do or where to begin. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with money or meetings or the type of strategic thinking that had carried him so far in his life. This was different. This was real. The kind of real that stripped away the veneer of his world and made everything he had built seem so distant, so inconsequential. Alice sat with her legs crossed, her eyes not quite meeting his, but not looking away either. She was still in her coat, still carrying the weight of a life that had given her more pain than anyone her age should have to bear. Julia, nestled on the couch, had drifted into a deeper sleep, her breathing slow and a silent even. Her stuffed rabbit now resting by her side, forgotten in the safety of a moment she hadn't been given in years. Mark glanced at the girl, his chest tightening. A child shouldn't have to go through this, he thought. A child shouldn't have to carry that kind of weight. And yet, here they were, in this room, in this place, so far removed from the lives they had known, but still shackled by their pasts. He thought about his son, about the pain that had been his constant companion, and realized that the ache he felt was not so different from theirs. A movement across the room caught his attention. Alice had stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked over to the window and stood there, her gaze fixed outside, but her face turned slightly toward him, as though she were aware of his scrutiny but was choosing to ignore it. The city sprawled beneath them, vast and indifferent. But here, in this space, with these girls, Mark could feel something in him stir. A desire to protect, to do more than just provide comfort. He wanted to fix this, to give them the safety they had been denied. "Do you want some food?" Mark asked, though it felt like the question itself was inadequate. Food? What did food matter right now? What did any of this luxury matter when these girls had come to him for help, for something real? He was a man of resources, of wealth, of contracts and numbers. But this felt different. Alice looked at him then, her eyes steady, as though she were weighing him again, just as she had before. But this time there was something softer in her gaze, something that told Mark she might believe him, just for a moment. "What is there?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. The edge of suspicion gone. Mark exhaled, standing up and walking toward the kitchen. "There's grilled cheese, tomato soup." "Something simple," he said, his mind racing. You're welcome to have whatever you like." He opened the refrigerator, pulling out the ingredients, trying to focus on something so simple, so basic, that it felt like it might ground him. As he worked, he thought about Alice's words. "You used to know right from wrong before you got rich." And something about that made his chest tighten, made his hands falter for just a moment as he spread butter on the bread. Right from wrong, it wasn't something he'd given much thought to in recent years. His life had been about more complicated things: profit margins, quarterly reports, investments, mergers. But in the quiet of this moment, with the fire crackling softly behind him, "Go," the weight of Alice's words came crashing down. What did it mean to be a good man when everything you had built was based on power and wealth? What had happened to the man who had once cared, who had once believed in something more than his own success? Mark finished making the sandwiches and set them down on the counter, looking over at the girls. Alice had moved closer, her eyes now focused on the food in front of her, but she still hadn't said anything. Julia stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering open as the smell of food filled the room. Mark felt a strange tug in his chest. He didn't know what he had expected when he brought them into his world. Maybe he thought they would be grateful, or maybe he was just trying to fill the emptiness he felt with resembled normalcy. But there was nothing normal about this. Nothing that could be fixed with food or clothes or anything else that came easily to him. As Julia sat up, rubbing her eyes and looking at the food, Mark caught Alice's gaze. There was something in her eyes now, a glimmer of something, perhaps acceptance, perhaps just the quiet resignation of someone who had learned too much too early. She didn't speak as she reached for the sandwich, but her hand brushed his as she took it. It was a brief touch, one that lasted for only a moment, but it sent a shock through him. In that moment, Mark realized that this was what mattered. This was what he had been missing all these years, buried beneath the layers of his wealth, his work, his walls. He had built a life that was supposed to make him happy. But it was in this room with these two girls that he found something he hadn't realized he was searching for. A reason to care, a reason to fight for something that was real, something worth protecting. Julia took a bite of the sandwich, her face lighting up in delight, and Mark watched her, his heart swelling with an unfamiliar warmth. It was a small thing, but it felt like a victory. A victory in a world that had seemed so far removed from the simple joys of a child's laughter, child's trust. Alice's eyes flicked toward him again, and for the first time, there was no calculation in her gaze. There was no distance. Just the quiet understanding of someone who had seen too much and who, for the first time, was being given a chance to let go. "Oh, thank you," she said, her voice steady. But there was something in it now, something soft Mark hadn't heard before. He nodded, though he didn't know how to respond. What could he say? "I'm sorry?" It seemed inadequate. The words weren't enough to make up for what they had been through, for the life they had been forced to live. But they were enough for now. For now, he was here. And that was something. The evening passed slow, the kind of slow that feels like it's giving you space to breathe, space that is filled with the quiet weight of choices made and choices still to come. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the girls were in some way teaching him as much as he was trying to teach them. They were so far removed from the life he had created for himself, but in their silence, in the way they held their grief close, he began to understand something he had long ago forgotten, that life was not about accumulating things or building empires. It was about connection, about human touch, about being seen. And here, in this cold, marble-walled penthouse, they had made him realize that the only thing that truly mattered was how we care for each other. Julia had fallen asleep soon after the sandwiches, curling up in Alice's lap as if that was all she had ever known to do. Mark watched them for a moment, the two of them there on the couch, holding each other with a quiet strength that seemed out of place in such a grand room. It was almost as though their presence was the thing that brought warmth to the space, not the fire crackling in the hearth. Alice had shifted restlessly a few times, but now, as the night deepened, she remained still. Mark didn't know what to say to her anymore. He had offered them food, shelter, and even his time, but he had the nagging feeling that none of those things were what they needed most. No, they needed safety, they needed stability. And though he didn't know how to give them that, he knew that somehow he was supposed to try. He walked over to the bar and poured himself another drink. The scotch burned as it went down, and the familiar warmth of alcohol coursed through him. But tonight it felt hollow. The walls of the penthouse seemed closer now, as if the space that had once felt so vast had suddenly shrunk, pressing in on him from all sides. He didn't want to be the man who fixed everything, because he knew that wasn't possible. But he couldn't help but feel like this moment, this room, this decision was the one that would either define him or break him. Alice's voice cut through his thoughts. "You're not like him." The words hung between them like a breath that had been held too long. Mark turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. "Like who?" he asked, though he knew. "Like our dad," Alice said, her gaze steady. "He never stayed. He never really cared." Mark's heart sank, a weight pulling it lower with every syllable she spoke. He didn't want to ask, didn't want to hear the pain in her words, but he couldn't stop himself. "What happened to him?" "He left when I was little," Alice said, her voice low, like she was speaking about something too painful to give full voice to. "He came around sometimes, but he wasn't really there, not for us, not for Mama." Her words sliced through him with a rawness that left him gasping. He could feel the distance she had placed between herself and the idea of a father, a man who should have been there for her, for Julia, a man who had failed them. "Do you think," Mark started, his voice thick with the weight of the question, "that I can be the man you need me to be?" Alice looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, weighing him in a way he had never been measured before. "I don't need you to be anything. I just need you to be here, for us, now. That's enough." Her words were simple, and yet they carried the kind of weight that only years of hurt could bring. He nodded, the knot in his chest tightening further. Alice didn't need him to be a savior or a hero, or even someone who could fix their lives. She just needed him to be present, to be reliable. And maybe, just maybe, that was all he needed to be too. The rest of the evening passed quietly. The only sounds the soft crackling of the fire and the occasional shuffle of feet across the marble floor. The weight of the world had shifted, just slightly, and Mark felt it in his bones. These girls, Alice and Julia, had shown him a different kind of strength, a kind that didn't come from wealth or success, but from the quiet determination to survive, to protect, to live, despite everything the world had thrown at them. And for the first time in a long while, Mark felt like he was no longer alone in his pursuit of redemption. When the morning came, it was like a breath of fresh air. The cold had lifted, and the world outside seemed a little less heavy, though still undeniably broken. Mark stood by the window, his eyes lingering on the city below. The skyline had always been his domain, his empire, his legacy. But now, it seemed like just another backdrop to the real story unfolding before him. Alice and Julia were still asleep, but Mark knew that today would be different. Today for Foring Whore. Today he would take the next step, the step that would move him closer to becoming the man they needed him to be. He had never been a man who gave easily, but in this moment, he understood that what mattered wasn't about what he could give them in terms of wealth or comfort. It was about being there, being consistent, being the kind of person they could trust when it had seemed like trust was a luxury they could no longer afford. The sun had barely risen, but the light was already creeping into the room, spilling across the floor like a promise. Mark turned from the window and walked toward the kitchen. He had eggs to scramble, coffee to brew, and a family to feed. It felt right in a way that he couldn't explain. When Alice and Julia woke, they were different, at ease in the space, at ease with him. Julia grinned sleepily, asking for pancakes as soon as her eyes opened. Alice, though quieter, looked at Mark with a new understanding, a soft acknowledgement that spoke volumes. It wasn't much. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in years, Mark felt like he was home. The morning unfolded in the warmth of routine. The smell of coffee filled the air, and the soft sizzle of eggs in the pan made the space feel more like a home than it ever had before. Mark worked quietly, his movements measured, precise, like they had been for years in the sterile world of boardrooms and investments. But today, in this small kitchen, there was a difference. The rhythm was slower, more intentional, like he had all the time in the world, though he knew that wasn't true. There was still a future to plan, still a battle to fight. But for now there was peace, and he would hold on to it for as long as he could. Julia, ever the early riser, was the first to join him at the counter, her small hands already pulling a chair out to climb up. Her feet kicked at the base, and her face lit up when she saw the pancakes he was cooking. "Are we having pancakes for breakfast?" she asked, woke, the excitement in her voice as innocent and untainted as the joy she seemed to find in the simplest things. "Of course," Mark said, his voice lighter than it had been in years, "big ones too, if you like." Alice came in just after, rubbing sleep from her eyes and yawning. Her movements were more deliberate, as though she still had some unspoken weight on her shoulders, even here. But there was a softness in the way she looked at Mark as she took her seat at the table. He could see it in her eyes, had shifted, maybe she didn't trust him fully yet, but she was starting to believe in what he had promised. "I'm making extra today," Mark said, putting more pancakes on the griddle. "We have enough for second helpings." Alice nodded silently, but her lips quirked just the smallest bit, the hint of a smile threatening to break through. Mark watched her, his heart aching at the complexity of her quiet. There was so much she had seen, so much she had carried by herself. And yet, despite all of it, she was still here, still willing to give him a chance. Julia, noticing the way Alice's smile shifted, leaned over and whispered to her sister, "You gonna eat 2 pancakes?" Alice glanced at her sister, then at Mark, her expression softening. "Maybe 3, she replied, her voice quieter than usual, but warm with something Mark hadn't heard from her before, humor. Mark smiled, feeling the shift in the air. The warmth that had filled the room wasn't just from the stove anymore. It had begun to take root, filling the empty spaces between them. He wasn't sure how much of this was real, how much of it could be sustained, but he had the feeling that they were all moving towards something different now. Something better. The pancakes were served, and they ate together, the conversation flowing freely between bites. Julia babbled about the animals she had seen in the zoo a few days ago, her excitement infectious. She had a way of lighting up the room with her words, making everything sound like an adventure. Alice listened with a quiet attentiveness, nodding at the right moments but never interrupting her sister's excitement. Mark found himself laughing more than he had in a long time. The sound of it strange but welcome. After breakfast, Mark cleared the table and started washing the dishes. A task that felt oddly grounding. Alice stood up and walked over to him, her small hands reaching for a dish towel. "You don't have to do everything," she said softly. It wasn't an accusation, but a statement of something she was still learning, a kind of independence that came from being too self-sufficient for too long. "You help or three poor all." Mark shook his head. "I'm not doing everything, just this part." He handed her the towel. "You help too." Alice took the towel from him, her fingers brushing his coat, and for a moment there was no tension between them. No walls, just the quiet companionship that had always been missing in his life. "Thank you for the pancakes," Julia said, her face still full from breakfast, her stuffed rabbit in her lap. "Are we doing anything fun today?" Mark paused, the dish in his hands forgotten for a moment. "What would you like to do?" he asked, his tone thoughtful. He hadn't made any plans for the day, hadn't thought about what came next. But now, with them here, with this strange sense of purpose in the air, he found himself wanting to give them something that mattered. Julia's eyes sparkled as she hopped up from the table. "Can we go to the park?" "I want to see the squirrels again." Alice, who had been silent for a while, looked up. "The park sounds nice." Mark nodded, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "The park it is, then." They finished cleaning up and made their way outside, the cold air biting at their cheeks but feeling strangely invigorating after the warmth of the apartment. Mark pulled on his coat and helped Julia with hers. The simple acts of care and protection now feeling like the most important things he had done in years. As they walked through the streets of the city, Julia skipped ahead, her laughter ringing out, bouncing off the buildings. Alice walked a little slower, her eyes scanning the world around her, with a quiet intensity that Mark had come to expect. She was always looking, always thinking, always waiting for the next moment of disappointment. But today Mark noticed something different in her. She wasn't as guarded as she had been. There was a softness to her now, a flicker of trust that hadn't been there before. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They made their way to the park, the early spring air beginning to thaw the ground. And as Mark watched Julia chase the squirrels, laughing without a care in the world, he felt a small part of himself begin to heal. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, or the day after that. He didn't know how this story would end. But for today, for this moment, Mark Truman understood what it meant to be truly alive. And it had nothing to do with buildings or success or wealth. It had everything to do with the people you choose to stand beside. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the park. It was a quiet evening, the city settling into its usual rhythm. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The weight of his past, the years of work and ambition that had defined him, felt distant now. In the presence of these two girls, it was as if the world had shifted its focus. It was no longer about the glass towers he had built or the deals he had closed. It was about Alice and Julia, about providing them with the one thing he had always sought, but had never truly found, a sense of home. Julia was still chasing squirrels, her small feet quick as she darted around, squealing with delight every time she spotted one. Alice, though, had slowed down, her eyes on the horizon, her movements deliberate, as if she were still processing everything that had happened in the past few days. Mark didn't push her. He simply walked beside her, the quiet of the park surrounding them, the distant hum of traffic in the background. "Do you like it here?" Mark asked, his voice low, uncertain. Alice's gaze didn't waver from the path ahead, but she nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "It's different," she said after a moment, her voice soft but steady. "It's quieter than what we're used to." Mark let the silence stretch between them. He wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Was she adjusting, or was she still holding herself back, waiting for the inevitable crash? He knew better than to expect her to trust him right away, to think that everything could be fixed in a single day, in a few simple acts of kindness. But he couldn't deny the fact that for the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something that mattered, something more than just making money or building his legacy. Alice glanced over at him then, and there was something in her eyes, a flicker of vulnerability that caught him off guard. For a moment she seemed almost human. The walls she had built around herself were still there, but they were less impenetrable than they had been. "Do you think we'll stay? Do you think we'll stay?" she asked, her voice quieter than before, the question laced with an uncertainty that made Mark's chest tighten. It wasn't just a question about the apartment, about the food, or about the immediate comfort he could offer. It was a question about belonging, about permanence. Would she allow herself to trust in this place, in this fragile sense of safety he was offering? Mark exhaled slowly, his breath coming out in a cloud of mist. "I don't know, but I'm here, Alice. For as long as you need me." She didn't respond immediately, but after a moment she nodded. It wasn't an answer, not really, but it was something small, something that said she was starting to believe in the possibility of a life beyond survival. Julia finally came running back, her face flushed from the cold and excitement, her rabbit still clutched tightly in her arms. She skidded to a stop in front of Mark, her eyes wide with excitement. "Do you think they'll come back tomorrow?" Mark furrowed his brow. "Who?" "The squirrels," Julia said, her voice full of seriousness, as though the fate of the squirrels was the most important thing in the world. "I want to feed them tomorrow," Mark chuckled softly, ruffling her hair. "We'll make sure they come back. But we'll need more breadcrumbs next time." Julia's face lit up, her grin as wide as ever. "Deal," she said before running off again. "I know, this time in search of more squirrels to chase." Alice watched her sister with something that resembled tenderness in her eyes. And for the briefest moment, Mark saw a glimpse of the girl she could have been, if the world had been kinder to her, if she had never known the kind of pain that had shaped her. She turned back to him after a moment, her expression softening, her guard slipping just a little more. "We've never had anything like this before," Alice said quietly, almost to herself. "A place that feels like it could be ours." Mark didn't have an answer for that, not really. What could he say? That they could stay here forever, that everything would be perfect, that the world would always be kind? He couldn't promise any of that. He knew too much about how fragile everything was, how quickly things could change. But he could promise this perennial he would be here. He would do his best to give them the one thing they had been denied for so long: stability. And whatever else came with it, they would face it together. "I know," he said, his voice low but steady, "and I won't let it go." Alice looked at him, her expression a mix of disbelief and something else, something he couldn't name. It was the closest thing to trust that he had seen in her in days. For the first time, he didn't feel like an intruder in her life. For the first time, he felt like part of it. The three of them stayed in the park a little longer, the city stretching out before them, its lights beginning to twinkle in the evening. Julia had found a new interest in the squirrels, and Alice had finally allowed herself to relax, her gaze shifting between her sister's exuberant energy and the quiet peace of the world around them. When they returned to the penthouse, Mark felt a sense of something shifting inside him, a sense of possibility. The building was as cold and indifferent as ever, but it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a home. Later that night, as he tucked Julia into bed, he lingered for a moment, brushing a lock of hair away from her face. She was already asleep, her rabbit nestled by her side. He stood there for a long time, watching her breathe, listening to the soft hum of the city outside the window. Alice was in her room, and the apartment felt quieter than it had been all evening. The sounds of the city seemed distant now, almost faded, as if they didn't matter anymore. For the first time in a long time, Mark felt like he could breathe. He could see the possibilities ahead of him, even if they were uncertain. He had come to this place with nothing but his wealth and his ambition. But what he had found here with these girls was something that money couldn't buy. A chance to rebuild, to become something more than the sum of his successes and failures. And as he turned off the lights and headed for his own bed, he realized that this quiet moment was all he needed. The rest, the world outside, would still be there when the sun came up. For now, he was home. The morning light came gently, casting a soft glow across the room. It filtered in through the large windows of the penthouse, regal, illuminating the space in a way that made everything feel less distant, less empty. Mark woke early before the girls, as was becoming his habit, and sat by the window, his eyes fixed on the city below. There was something different about the way he looked at it now, less a symbol of his empire, less a reflection of all he had worked for, and more a backdrop to a new chapter in his life. For so many years, his mornings had been filled with emails and calls, contracts and negotiations. His life had been a series of meetings, boardrooms, and strategies to secure his legacy. But now he found himself looking for something else, something more intangible but more important. His thoughts drifted back to the girls, how they had come into his life so suddenly, how they had shaken something deep within him that he had long buried. "You used to know right from wrong before you got rich," Alice had said. The words echoed in his mind, and for a moment Mark felt the sting of truth in them. It wasn't just the wealth or the success that had kept him distant from the world. It was his fear of becoming vulnerable, of opening himself up to the very things that might break him. But in the quiet of that morning, as he sat in the warmth of his home, he realized that the things that could break him were the very things that had begun to heal him. Alice and Julia, these two girls with their bruised pasts and guarded hearts, had brought him something he hadn't realized he needed: strength, the opportunity to rebuild, to find redemption. Not through the wealth he had accumulated, but through the connections he was beginning to form. The door creaked open behind him, and Mark turned to find Alice standing in the doorway. Her eyes still sleepy but alert, as though she had sensed something shifting in the room. She had that look about her, always watching, always weighing. "Morning," she said quietly, walking toward him. Her hair was still messy from sleep, her expression soft but thoughtful. "Good morning," Mark replied, his voice low, almost tentative. He hadn't expected her to be up so early, hadn't expected her to seek him out. But there she was, standing in the quiet space between them. The girl who had always kept herself at arm's length, now standing a little closer. She paused for a moment, then spoke again, her voice softer than usual. "You ever wonder if it's too late to change?" Mark's heart skipped a beat. The question was so simple, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken things. Alice's gaze was steady, but there was a vulnerability in her eyes that she rarely allowed anyone to see. "Too late to change what?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Too late to fix everything," Alice said, her gaze shifting toward the city outside the window. too late to make up for everything we lost." The weight of her words hung in the air, and for a moment Mark didn't know how to answer. What could he say? How could he possibly make up for the years she had lost? For the things she had endured. But he could feel the sincerity in her question, feel the deep, unspoken fear beneath it. "No," he said finally, his voice steady, though his heart was heavy with the truth of it. "It's never too late to change, not as long as you're still breathing." Alice turned her eyes back to him, and for the first time in a long time, he saw something flicker in her gaze. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was something close. Something that told him she was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a pause, a moment of understanding that passed between them, unspoken but clear. Julia appeared a few moments later, her small feet pattering across the floor as she came into the room with a grin on her face. Her stuffed rabbit still clutched tightly in her arms. "Morning," she exclaimed, her voice bright and full of energy, as if she had just woken up in the best of moods, as if the world was full of nothing but possibilities. Mark smiled at her, a genuine smile this time, not the mask he had worn for so many years. "Good morning, Julia," he said, his voice warmer than it had been in ages. She ran up to him, and without hesitation threw herself into his arms, wrapping her little arms around his neck. Mark's heart swelled as he lifted her up, holding her close to the weight of her small body. A grounding force, a reminder of everything that mattered in this moment. "Are we going to the park again today?" Julia asked, her face lighting up with excitement. "We can go wherever you want," Mark replied, his eyes meeting Alice's over Julia's head. "We'll do whatever makes you happy," Alice, watching them, seemed to soften just a little. She didn't say anything, but for the first time in a while, she looked at Julia with something that resembled tenderness. It was the beginning of a new rhythm, a new understanding. The days that followed were filled with more quiet moments, more laughter, and more unspoken understanding. Mark had come to realize that this life, this family, this chance was something he hadn't known he needed. And though he couldn't promise them everything, he could promise them this: he would be here. He would fight for them, not because he was their savior, but because, in his heart, he knew they were the ones who had saved him. The next few days passed in a blur of small moments. Julia's laughter, Alice's cautious smiles, the slow but steady process of becoming a family. Mark spent his days working, yes, but he found himself spending more time at home. More time with them, making sure they knew they were safe, they were loved. He wasn't sure what the future held, or if things would always be this way. But for the first time, he didn't need to know. He didn't need to plan every step. He just needed to be present. The city outside remained unchanged, its skyscrapers reaching for the sky, its hustle and bustle a constant hum in the background. But inside the penthouse, something had shifted. Something had been rebuilt, brick by brick, not with the weight of money or power, but with trust and love and presence. And for Mark, that was more than enough. The days began to blend into a routine, simple and steady Kyle, like the ticking of an old clock that never quite stops. The mornings were always the same rhythm, the smell of pancakes wafting through the apartment. The chatter of Julia, her feet quick to reach the kitchen, her excitement as she told Mark about the adventures she imagined in her sleep. Alice, still the quieter of the two, followed behind, her eyes flickering with something that wasn't quite trust, but was beginning to lean in that direction. Alice's was still cautious of everything, of everyone, but the space between them had shifted. She no longer watched Mark with the same guarded suspicion. Instead, she was more like an observer of her own life, unsure of whether she was allowed to be a part of something real. The walls were still up, but the cracks in them were starting to show. The afternoons were spent with the girls, taking them to the library, the park, to quiet corners of the city where life still held a kind of innocence. Mark found himself slowing down in ways he hadn't known he needed. He had always been in a rush, always pushing forward to the next meeting, the next goal, the next deal. But now, when he watched Julia chase pigeons in the park, or when he sat quietly beside Alice as she read, he felt a deep, grounding peace he hadn't realized he'd been missing. One afternoon, after a particularly sunny visit to the local zoo, Mark and the girls returned to the penthouse. Julia was holding Mark's hand as they walked inside, her excitement bubbling over from their trip. But as they stepped into the lobby, Mark noticed something, or rather, someone standing in the corner near the concierge desk. The man was tall, his posture rigid, his face familiar in a way that sent a chill running through Mark's spine. Nathan Maxwell. Mark stopped in his tracks, his heart thudding in his chest. Julia, noticing the sudden change in his demeanor, looked up at him with wide eyes. "Who's that?" she asked, her small voice a whisper. Alice, who had been just a few steps ahead, turned as well. For a brief moment, Mark was still. He had known this moment was coming, the inevitable confrontation. But it wasn't the confrontation he feared. It was the reminder of everything he had hoped to leave behind. Nathan Maxwell, the man who had abandoned Alice and Julia, was standing in the lobby of his building. The man locked eyes with Mark, and for a moment they simply stared at one another. There was nothing to be said. The silence between them was thick, as if the world had held its breath in that instant. Mark stood firm, his body tense, his jaw clenched. He could feel the girls beside him, their innocence a stark contrast to the tension that hung between him and Nathan. He wouldn't let them feel it, wouldn't let them see the weight of the past threatening to break through. Nathan took a step forward, his voice low, casual, as though nothing had changed. "Mr. Truman," he said, his words almost mocking, "I believe we need to talk." "About what?" Mark's voice was calm, controlled. But there was an edge to it now, a firmness that had not been there before. He wasn't the man who would back down this time, not for Nathan, not for anyone. Nathan smirked, but there was something in his eyes, something wild, something desperate. "About Julia," he said, his voice like gravel. "I want to see my daughter." The words stung, as though he had been slapped across the face. Mark didn't move, didn't speak for a long moment. He felt Alice shift beside him, her body tensing as if she could sense the storm brewing. Julia, oblivious to the tension, still held Mark's hand, her other hand clutching her stuffed rabbit, her eyes wide and "Julia is not your daughter," Mark said, his voice low but clear. His grip on her hand tightened, and for the briefest second, he felt the weight of everything he had done for her, the promises he had made, the love he had given. Nathan's smirk faded, his jaw tightening. "I'm her biological father," he said, his words biting. "That should count for something, don't you think?" "No," Mark replied, his voice unwavering. "What counts is who has been here for her, who has been her father, not just by blood, but by action, and that hasn't been you, Nathan. You don't get to walk back into her life like nothing has happened." There was a moment of stillness between them, and Mark could feel the pulse of something, fear, anger, something dark, rippling through the air. Nathan took a step closer, but Mark didn't move. He wasn't backing down this time. Alice's voice, soft but steady, broke the silence. "You've never been her father," she said, her eyes locking onto Nathan's. "You were just a shadow in our lives. And now you want to come back, as if you have a right to be here. You don't." Nathan's eyes flickered toward Alice, and there was something there. A flicker of recognition, of pain, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He shifted his gaze back to Mark, his stance defiant. "I'm not asking for permission," Nathan said. "I'm asking for my daughter." "I don't think you understand," Mark said, his voice thick with the weight of everything he was holding back. "You don't get to just show up and make demands. Not anymore, not after everything you've done." Nathan took another step closer, but Mark stood his ground. He wasn't going to let Nathan threaten this fragile peace they had built. He was going to let him tear apart the family they were slowly becoming. "You're making a mistake," Nathan said, his voice low, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just play house with them, with my daughter?" Mark felt something inside him snap. He stepped forward, his presence commanding, undeniable. "This is not about playing house, Nathan. This is about giving these girls what they deserve, what you never gave them." Nathan looked at him for a moment, his gaze full of frustration and rage. But something in his eyes told Mark that, for all his bravado, Nathan knew he had lost. He didn't have the power he once thought he did. And deep down, Mark knew he would fight for them every day, every step of the way. "You don't belong here," Mark said, his voice quiet but firm, "and you won't take them from me." Nathan said nothing, just turned and walked away, his shoulders hunched, his footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. Julia squeezed Mark's hand, her voice small and uncertain. "Is he going away?" Mark turned to her, kneeling down to meet her eyes. He smiled gently, though his heart was heavy. "Yes, sweetheart. He's going away," and as he stood and watched Nathan disappear into the elevator, a strange peace settled over him. It wasn't over, not yet. But for the first time, Mark felt a sense of certainty, of ownership over his life and the lives of these two girls. "We're safe," he whispered to Julia, brushing a strand of hair from her face, "and we always will be." Alice stood beside him, her gaze still lingering on the spot where Nathan had stood moments before. She didn't say anything, but Mark could see the shift in her. The walls were still there, still firm, but they were beginning to crumble, just a little at a time. The days blurred into each other, weaving a fabric of ordinary moments that Mark had never truly understood until now. The quiet mornings with Julia laughing at the breakfast table, and the afternoons spent at the park, and the evenings that stretched on with books and soft conversation. It was a rhythm he had always dismissed as mundane, unimportant in comparison to the world he had built with his own hands. But now it was everything. These small, simple moments were the pieces of life that he had overlooked, the things that made it worth living. As the weeks passed, Mark felt himself changing. The rigid walls of his carefully curated life had begun to crumble, and in their place was something softer, something more open. He spent less time in his office, less time in meetings, and more time with the girls. It wasn't a conscious decision, but the weight of his past no longer felt as heavy. In their presence he had found a kind of peace that he had never expected. Alice, always so guarded, had begun to trust him more, her walls slowly coming down, one small gesture at a time. Julia, with her boundless energy and unfiltered joy, had filled the space with laughter, reminding Mark of the innocence that still existed in the world. One evening, as the sun began to dip behind the city's skyline, Mark sat on the balcony, watching the world below. The breeze was gentle, the air cooler now as fall settled in. Alice and Julia were inside, preparing for the small family celebration they had planned for Julia's birthday. It wasn't a big event, just a small cake, some decorations, and a few presents. But to Mark, it felt like the most important day of his life. Julia had never had a proper birthday party, never had a moment to call her own. And now here they were, making memories together, creating something that Julia could carry with her always. Alice stepped onto the balcony beside him, her eyes scanning the horizon, her posture relaxed for the first time in weeks. She looked at him, her gaze steady, but there was a softness in her expression now. It was subtle, but it was there. She had stopped looking at him like a stranger, like someone she had to guard against. There was still a distance between them, but it was no longer the same cold distance. "Do you think she's happy?" Alice asked, her voice quiet but filled with something that Mark could not quite place. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of something he hadn't yet seen in her. Mark turned to look at her, his heart swelling with the enormity of the question. He knew what she meant. It wasn't just about the cake or the presents. It was about Julia's future, her sense of security, her ability to finally believe in the possibility of joy. "She's happy," Mark said, his voice low. "Certain she's starting to believe she can be." Alice nodded, her eyes softening. For a moment there was silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes after understanding has passed between two people, the kind that signals the beginning of something deeper. Julia burst through the door, her eyes wide with excitement, a big grin on her face. "It's my birthday!" "It's really my birthday." She jumped up and down, the energy of the day finally spilling out of her. Mark smiled, the warmth of her joy filling the space. "Yes, it is. And we're going to make it the best one yet." The rest of the evening was filled with laughter, with Julia blowing out candles, with Alice helping her sister open presents, and with Mark watching them, his heart full in a way it had never been before. The cake was small, the decorations simple, right? But in that room, surrounded by the warmth of the girls and the life they were building together, Mark felt as though everything had come full circle. This was the family he had always longed for, the family he had never known he could have. That night, as Mark tucked Julia into bed and kissed her forehead, he stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her sleep. She was safe, she was loved, and that was all that mattered. Alice was still awake when he returned to the living room, her eyes glued to the window, her thoughts far away. Mark walked over to her and sat down beside her, the quiet of the night surrounding them. There was a calmness to the air now, a stillness that settled over the apartment like a blanket. "Are you okay?" Mark asked, his voice soft but steady. Alice looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she smiled, a real smile, one that reached her eyes. "I'm okay," she said, her voice quiet. "For the first time in a long time, I think I might be." Mark sat beside her, the silence between them comfortable. He didn't need to fill it with words. The truth was there between them. He had become part of their story, and they had become part of his. The night stretched on, the sounds of the city distant, almost drowned out by the warmth of the apartment, by the presence of the two girls who had quietly, without fanfare, become his family. Tomorrow would come, and the world outside would continue to turn. But for now, Mark had found something more lasting than ambition or success. He had found peace. And he had found it in the quiet moments, the mornings with pancakes, the evenings with hot chocolate, right? And the stillness of nights spent with the people who mattered most. And that was enough. The morning after Julia's birthday was quieter than the day before, the excitement of the celebration still lingering in the air. like the sweet scent of cake that had long since faded. Mark sat at the kitchen table, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of his coffee mug, watching as the morning light filtered through the curtains. The city outside seemed distant, muted in its usual clamor, almost as though it, too, was settling into the peace of the day. Alice had already gone off to school, her steps deliberate, as always. She was adjusting, and Mark could see it, how she was starting to trust the rhythm of their life, how she was learning to live without constantly looking over her shoulder. Julia, however, was still at home, wrapped in the comfort of the apartment, her face glowing with the innocence of childhood that too often had been stolen from her by the world outside. As Mark sat there, lost in thought, the door to the bedroom creaked open, and Julia walked in, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her arms. She still wore the same sleepy smile she always had in the mornings. Her eyes barely open as she approached him. "Can we go to the park today?" she asked, her voice thick with the remnants of sleep. Mark looked up at her, his heart tightening. This small request, so simple, so pure, was the kind of thing he had never thought he would hear from a child who had once been lost, once had nowhere to go. But here she was, asking for something as ordinary as a trip to the park, a symbol of the life she was beginning to build. "Of course," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Oh, we'll go as soon as you're ready." Julia grinned, her eyes lighting up. "I want to see the squirrels again," she said, as though she were sharing a secret with him, one that only the two of them understood. Mark smiled, a real smile this time, and stood up from the table. It wasn't much. A trip to the park, a few hours spent in the fresh air, but it was everything. It was a moment of normalcy, a moment of hope. And in that moment Mark realized that these small, unremarkable acts of love, of caring for these girls, were what made a life worth living. After a quick breakfast, the three of them set out for the park. The air was crisp, the kind of early fall air that reminded Mark of the seasons that came and went, of the ways in which time always seemed to slip through his fingers. But for now, time stood still, just for this moment. The park was alive with the colors of autumn, leaves rustling in the trees. The world a patchwork of reds, oranges, and yellows. Julia, skipping ahead, her laughter filling the air, was as much a part of that moment as the trees themselves, as the quiet peace that had settled over them all. Alice was quieter today, her eyes distant again. But there was something different about the way she moved. She wasn't as closed off as she had been. And when Julia pulled her into a game of tag, Alice followed without hesitation, her footsteps light and almost carefree. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Small, slow progress. Mark watched them for a moment, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. There was no blueprint for this. No guidebook, no map that could show him how to be the father these girls needed, how to rebuild their lives from the wreckage that had come before. But there was love, and that was enough. Later, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, they made their way back to the apartment, their arms full of leaves and memories of the day. Mark felt the weight of the world shift again, just slightly, but enough to make him feel like he was standing on solid ground for the first time in years. That evening, after dinner, as they sat together on the couch, Julia leaning against him, Alice at the far end with her book, Mark felt the quiet of the apartment settle around them. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't even close, but it was real, and in that moment it was enough. Julia yawned and stretched out beside him, her rabbit resting by her side. Mark looked down at her, his heart swelling. She was safe, she was home, and that was all he needed. For now, for this moment, that was enough. Alice shifted beside him, her book closed now, Her eyes turned toward the window. She wasn't looking at him, but Mark could feel her presence, could feel the shift in the air between them. She was still holding on to something, still carrying a weight that was too heavy for someone her age. But she was starting to let go, little by little. The cracks in her walls were deepening, and he wasn't sure how long it would take for them to fall entirely. But he was patient. He had to be. For her, for Julia. "Do you ever think about the future?" Alice asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark turned to her, surprised by the question. It wasn't like Alice to ask about the future. She had always been more focused on the present, on surviving the moment, getting through the day. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. "I mean," she hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her book. "Oh, do you think things will always be like this?" Mark leaned back against the couch, taking a moment to think about her question. It was a big one, and one he wasn't sure how to answer. The future was uncertain, filled with so many variables that it seemed impossible to predict. But in this moment, with Alice sitting beside him, with Julia tucked against his side, he knew one thing for sure: he would face it, whatever it was, with them. "I don't know what the future holds," Mark said finally, his voice low but sure. "But I do know this: we're in it together, and whatever comes, we'll face it as a family." Alice didn't reply immediately. She simply nodded, her gaze still fixed on the window, as though she were searching for something in the distant skyline. But Mark knew she had heard him. He knew that, for the first time, she was starting to believe in something she hadn't allowed herself to believe in before. That the future wasn't something to fear, but something they could face together. The days continued to pass, each one bringing them closer to a future that was still uncertain, still fragile, but one they could now see more clearly. And as the weeks wore on, as the seasons began to change again, Mark found himself not looking back anymore, not wishing for the past, but looking forward to whatever came next. Because now he knew the truth. He had found his purpose. He had found his family. And that was more than enough. The days blurred into each other, weaving a fabric of ordinary moments that Mark had never known before. The mornings were filled with pancakes and laughter, the afternoons with trips to the library and park, and the evenings with stories shared over simple meals. There were moments of silence, too, moments where Alice would sit with her book, lost in her thoughts, and Julia would hum quietly as she colored. But even in the silence there was a kind of peace. It was the peace of a home being built not on wealth, but on trust. Mark had often thought that success was defined by what you could create, the buildings, the investments, the tangible things that stood as proof of your labor. But now he was learning that success was something more elusive, something that didn't fit neatly into a portfolio or a boardroom presentation. Success was the quiet moments, the ones when you sat together as a family, shared a meal, and realized that, for the first time, you were home. Alice was still quiet, still the girl who carried the weight of too many years on her shoulders. But she was beginning to soften slowly but surely. Mark noticed the small things, the way her posture had changed, the way her eyes would linger on Julia with a tenderness he hadn't seen before. It was as if, with each passing day, she was allowing herself to believe that she could be a part of something bigger, something safe. Julia, of course, was as open and full of life as ever, in her laughter infectious, her energy boundless. She had made Mark laugh more times than he could count, had filled the empty spaces of his life with her small but powerful presence. Sometimes he would catch her looking up at him, her eyes full of trust, and in those moments he would realize that he would do anything to keep her safe, to protect her from the world that had already taken so much from her. One night after dinner, as they all sat together on the couch, the soft glow of the fireplace casting warm light across the room, Alice surprised him by asking a question that had been lingering between them for days. "Do you think we'll always be okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It was a simple question, but one that carried the weight of everything they had been through, everything they had lost, and everything they had yet to face. Mark looked at her, his heart heavy with the truth of it. "I don't know what the future holds, Alice," he said slowly. "I wish I could tell you that everything will always be easy, but I can't. What I can promise you is this: we'll always face it together. Whatever comes, we'll handle it as a family." Alice didn't respond immediately, but she nodded, her eyes softening slightly. She wasn't fully there yet, but she was getting closer, and for Mark that was enough. Julia, ever the optimist, leaned forward and wrapped her arms around Mark's neck. "We're always going to be okay, right?" she asked, her voice full of that simple, unshakable belief that children had. "Because we're together." Mark smiled, his heart swelling with love for this little girl who had no idea just how much she had changed him. "Yes, sweetheart," he said, holding her close, "we'll always be okay because we have each other." The days continued to pass, right? And with each one, the walls around Alice seemed to crumble just a little more. She started to open up in small ways, sharing her thoughts with Mark when she had always kept them to herself before. She began to talk more openly with Julia, laughing at her silly jokes and sharing stories of the past that Mark had never heard before. There was still a distance between them, a quiet barrier that Alice wasn't ready to tear down completely. But it was getting smaller, 1 inch at a time. Mark often found himself watching her, wondering what was going on inside her head. She was so much like him in many ways, determined, self-sufficient, cautious. But there was a softness to her now, a vulnerability that she hadn't shown before. And it made Mark believe more than ever that she was starting to trust him, starting to see that she didn't have to carry everything alone. One afternoon, after picking the girls up from school, Mark drove them to a small park they hadn't visited before. It was quiet there, away from the hustle of the city, surrounded by trees that were just beginning to change color for the fall. Julia ran ahead, as always, eager to explore, while Alice hung back with Mark, her footsteps slow and deliberate. "Do you like it here?" Mark asked, breaking the silence between them. Alice looked around, her eyes scanning the park. "It's peaceful," she said quietly. "I like it." Mark smiled, his gaze lingering on her. "You don't have to worry, you know. You're safe here. With me." Alice didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Mark wondered if she was going to pull away, if she was going to retreat behind the walls she had spent so long building. But then, without a word, she stepped a little closer to him, her arm brushing against his. It was small, almost imperceptible, but to Mark it was everything. They spent the rest of the afternoon in the park, with Julia leading the way, her laughter ringing out like music, while Alice and Mark followed behind, walking side by side in a comfortable silence. By the time the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the trees, they made their way back to the car, their hearts light and full. Mark realized that for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just walking through life. He was living it, and he had found something worth living for. That night, as they sat down to dinner, Mark looked at the two girls, their faces full of the quiet joy that had come to define their days. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living, they were growing, they were becoming a family. And that was more than he had ever hoped for. As they ate, laughing together, talking about their day, Mark felt a deep, quiet sense of contentment. The world outside could keep spinning, keep turning, but in this small corner of it, they were safe. They were home. And for the first time in a long time, Mark didn't feel the weight of the past bearing down on him. He didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. He had found his purpose. He had found his family, and that was enough. The following days unfolded like pages in a book Mark never expected to read. Every morning, the apartment seemed to breathe in rhythm with the girls, right? Each of them waking to a world where, for the first time, the future was filled with possibility. The weight of what had come before, of loss, of regret, of the wreckage of lives that had once seemed beyond repair, was slowly shifting into something else, something unspoken but undeniable. It wasn't perfect, not by any stretch. There were moments when Alice would retreat into her silence, her gaze turning inward, away from the present. And there were nights when Julia would wake up with a soft whimper, her small body trembling from dreams of things Mark would never fully understand. But even in those moments, there was something new, a quiet strength growing between them all, woven into the fabric of their days. Julia had become a whirlwind of curiosity, a small but fierce force who seemed to take on the world with her laughter, her endless energy, and her boundless love for the simple things. She had taken to spending her afternoons outside, running through the nearby park, chasing after anything that moved. What of the move? Mark watched her from the window sometimes, her form a blur of motion in the golden light of late afternoons, and he would feel a sharp, sudden ache in his chest. This was what he had wanted, what he had never known he needed. Alice, on the other hand, was quieter. But in the quiet, Mark began to see the things he had missed before. She wasn't just the child of silence and guarded emotion. She was a girl who had learned how to protect herself, to shield her heart from the world that had broken it. But now, slowly, she was learning that she didn't have to do it alone. She was learning to let go, piece by piece, of the things she had carried for so long. One afternoon, as the fall leaves began to turn golden and crisp, Mark found himself standing in the living room, watching Alice sit at the table, her brow furrowed in concentration as she worked through a math problem. Julia was nearby, humming a tune she had picked up from one of her favorite cartoons, her stuffed rabbit resting on her lap. Alice's gaze flickered up for a moment, catching his kano, and for the first time in what felt like years, there was no wariness in her eyes, no hesitation, just a quiet, steady trust that had slowly been cultivated between them. She didn't look away, and neither did he. "You're getting good at this," he said, his voice soft, steady. "I'm proud of you." Alice paused, her pencil still in hand, but she didn't respond right away. Instead, she gave him a small nod, her fingers tightening around the pencil. Then, as though she had decided to let the words fall from her mouth, she spoke. "I never thought I'd be here," she said, her voice low but firm. Mark didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure how to. He didn't have the words for it, not for the weight of what she was saying. So, instead, he did what he did best. He listened. "I never thought I'd be in a place where it wasn't about survival," she continued, her eyes turning back to her paper, "where I didn't have to fight for everything, for food, for safety, for love." Mark felt something inside him shift at her words, a tightening in his chest, a lump rising in his throat. It was the first time she had spoken so openly about what she had been through, about the things she had held inside for so long. "You don't have to fight here, Alice," he said softly. "Not anymore. You're safe." She didn't answer right away. She just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement, as though she were still deciding whether she could believe him. But Mark could see the flicker of something in her eyes, a quiet, tentative hope that he hadn't seen before. Julia's voice broke through the stillness, then her question as innocent as always. "Daddy, can we go to the zoo tomorrow?" Mark smiled, turning toward her. "I think that sounds like a great idea." Julia grinned, her excitement palpable. "Yes! I love the monkeys." Alice looked up again, her expression softening. She didn't smile, not yet, but her eyes softened, and that, for Mark, was enough. The next day they went to the zoo. Julia was in her element, running from exhibit to exhibit, her laughter filling the air as she pointed out the animals she loved. Allie stayed close, her steps quieter, more deliberate, coy. But even she couldn't help the small smile that crept onto her face when Julia got excited about a particularly energetic chimpanzee. Mark watched them, his heart full. It was a simple thing, this outing to the zoo, this small moment of normalcy, but it was everything. Later, as they walked back to the car, Julia chattered endlessly about the animals they had seen, her face alight with the wonder of the day. Alice, walking beside Mark, was quieter again, but there was a lightness to her step, a softness in the way she held herself. "You like the zoo?" Mark asked, glancing at her. Alice looked up at him, her eyes meeting his for a moment. "It was nice," she said. And there was something about the way she said it, something more than just the words. As they drove home, the silence in the car wasn't uncomfortable, but comfortable. It was the kind of silence that came from shared understanding, from the knowledge that they were finally building something real. At home, Mark found himself sitting at the kitchen table, looking out the window at the city beyond. The skyline, still a reflection of his past ambitions, no longer felt like a weight. It felt distant, far removed from the life he had built here with Alice and Julia. Alice came in, her steps soft as she approached him. For a moment she just stood there, looking out at the city with him, her silence speaking volumes. "I don't know what the future holds, Mark," she said quietly, "but for the first time I'm not scared of it." Mark turned to her, his heart swelling with the quiet truth of her words. "You don't have to be scared anymore," he said softly. "You're not alone." And in that moment Mark knew that they had made it. They had come through the hardest part, the part where they had to rebuild, where they had to trust again. The future, uncertain as it was, no longer held the same weight of fear. It held possibility. The days that followed were as steady as the ones that had come before, and yet they felt different. Each moment Mark spent with the girls, the quiet evenings, the morning routines, the laughter that filled their small home, became more and more precious. The city outside the window continued to hum with life, its towering skyline a distant reminder of the world Mark had once lived in. But it no longer defined him. It was just a backdrop now, something that had been and would always be, but was no longer central to who he was. Alice had taken to spending more time outside, finding solace in the quiet of nature, often taking Julia with her on walks through the park. It was there, in the solitude of those moments, that Mark could see her beginning to soften more, her shoulders less tense, her eyes not just holding a kind of guarded hope, but a quiet acceptance. She no longer felt the need to protect herself from the world, not in the same way she had before. Julia, as always, was full of light, her laughter echoing in every corner of the apartment. She was the sun, casting brightness over everything, reminding Mark of the simplicity of joy, of the innocence that still existed, even after all they had endured. She asked him questions about everything: why the sky was blue, how clouds were made, what stars were, and always, always, about the animals at the zoo. There were moments when Mark thought about the past, about his son, about the life he had lost. It was impossible not to, but those thoughts no longer consumed him. They were there, but they were just memories now, fading into the background of a life that was no longer defined by grief and regret. One night, as the girls finished their homework and settled down to watch a movie, Mark found himself standing by the window again, looking out at the city, but this time, it didn't feel like a weight pressing down on him. It felt like the start of something new. He had built so much over the years, buildings, businesses, a name, but it was this, this small, quiet family that had given him the peace he had never known. The door to the living room creaked open, and Alice stepped inside, holding a notebook in her hands. She stood there for a moment, her eyes searching him out, before she came over to sit next to him. "I finished the story," she said quietly, her voice soft. "The one I've been writing." Mark looked at her, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You want to read it to me?" Alice nodded, a slight blush creeping across her cheeks. "I think so." She opened the notebook, and for a moment Mark thought about all the things she had been through, all the walls she had built, and all the ways she had begun to tear them down. He was proud of her, proud of the girl who had carried so much for so long, and yet had managed to find the strength to open her heart again. Alice cleared her throat and began to read aloud, her voice steady, though tinged with the quiet vulnerability that had always been a part of her. "The first time I saw him, I didn't know what to think. He was tall, and he looked like a man who knew what he was doing. But his eyes were different. I thought maybe he was lost too. Maybe that's why he found us. He didn't save us, not like some people say. He didn't sweep in and fix everything. But he stayed. And that made all the difference. In the end, it's the staying that matters. The way you show up, even when you don't know what to do. Because sometimes just being there is enough." Alice paused and looked at Mark, her eyes meeting his. "That's what you did for us," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Mark swallowed hard, his throat thick with emotion. He didn't know how to respond to that, how to tell her that she had done the same for him, that they had saved each other in ways neither of them could have imagined. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Instead, he pulled her into a hug, holding her close, feeling the weight of her words settle into his chest. For the first time in a long time, Mark knew that he wasn't alone anymore. He had found something worth fighting for, something that could never be measured in buildings or businesses, or the things he had once thought mattered. The woman, the boy, the man, the soldier who knows his worth, does not chase after money, fame, or choice. He builds instead a life with those who matter, and he stays no matter what. Thank you for following this story on Shoe Stories. If this story moved you, taught you something, or made you reflect on the meaning of silence, please like, subscribe to our channel, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below the video. Your voice matters. Let it be heard, whether it's in silence or loud, and don't go anywhere. Click on one of the videos displayed on your screen to watch more powerful stories about dignity and unexpected heroes. We'll see you in the next story.